In another world, power had once meant banners raised against tyrants, storms split by impossible wills, and dreams shouted so loudly that even the sea seemed to answer. But here, in the bruised heart of New York, power had curdled into something colder. It glowed from towering screens that washed the streets in patriotic gold and corporate blue. It smiled with perfect teeth from every broadcast and promised safety with a voice so polished it no longer sounded human. Below those screens, beneath the glow of Vought advertisements and the endless praise poured upon the Seven, people walked quickly and carefully, as if fear itself had become part of the weather. The city did not sleep. It merely trembled more quietly at night. Ambulance sirens drifted between glass towers. Reporters practiced outrage for cameras. Men in expensive suits discussed collateral damage as if it were an accounting term. Somewhere in an alley, a boy stared at a poster of Homelander and tried to look inspired, even as his mother tugged him forward before he could ask why heroes never came to their neighborhood until the cameras did. Every image said the same thing. Be grateful. Be obedient. Trust the strongest. And the tragedy of it was not that people believed the lie. It was that most of them no longer had the strength to imagine anything else. Then the sky split open. At first people thought it was another stunt. Another Vought spectacle timed perfectly for a product launch or emergency intervention. The clouds over Manhattan twisted into a black spiral, but the storm did not move like weather. It moved like something forcing its way through a locked door. Blue lightning tore jagged veins across the heavens, not flashing downward but outward, as though reality itself were cracking. Traffic stalled. Pedestrians froze. Phones rose into the air in 1,000 shaking hands. The city knew terror well, but this was different. This felt older. Less like a threat and more like an intrusion from a story that did not belong in their world. Then something fell through the rupture. It came down fast enough to scream against the wind, a dark shape spinning through electric light before slamming into the middle of an avenue, with enough force to buckle asphalt and flip 2 armored Vought vehicles onto their sides. Windows shattered up and down the block. Alarms began to wail. Smoke rolled outward in a gray ring. For one suspended instant, the whole street went silent. Then a hand rose from the crater. A young man climbed out through the dust, stretching as though he had merely woken from a nap. He wore sandals, red clothes, a yellow sash. On his back hung a simple straw hat tied to his neck by a string, and on his face sat the kind of grin this world had forgotten how to trust. He blinked up at the skyscrapers, looked from one overturned vehicle to the next, and laughed with the bright, effortless delight of someone who had landed in the wrong place and found that exciting rather than frightening. Monkey D. Luffy had arrived in the world of the boys, and within seconds he understood that something was wrong. Not because of the weapons suddenly trained on him from every direction. Not because drones were circling overhead. Not because civilians were running while trying not to appear panicked for the cameras already turning their way. It was in their faces, in the way they smiled after flinching, in the way they thanked authorities with voices that shook, in the way the word hero lived in their mouths like a prayer forced out at gunpoint. Luffy did not know this city, its companies, its politics, or its gods in capes. But he knew cages when he saw them, and these people carried invisible chains in the middle of the street. A staged soup attack was already underway 3 blocks down, though Luffy had no way of knowing that. Vought security had cordoned off the district for a controlled incident that would later become a trending rescue clip. An unstable low-tier soup was meant to threaten a bus of civilians until one of the 7 arrived to end the danger in a choreographed burst of righteous force. Ratings were predicted to be strong. Merchandise projections were even stronger. But when Luffy heard screaming, he did not wait for the script. He ran toward it. The cameras barely kept up. He bounced over the wrecked vehicles, stretched past barricades, and launched himself into the center of the scene with such reckless speed that the assigned Vought tactical team assumed he was attacking. Orders were shouted. Flash rounds fired. None of it mattered. Luffy caught a falling streetlight before it crushed a family, bent it aside like it weighed nothing, then slammed his fist into the pavement to stop the panicked bus from tipping over. The staged villain, confused and furious that someone else had entered his performance, charged him with a roar. Luffy looked at him for half a second, frowned as if insulted by the emptiness behind the man's eyes, and swatted him through the side of a parking structure. The crowd stared. They had seen power before. They had seen laser vision, engineered strength, and marketable brutality. But they had not seen this. They had not seen power move without posing for applause. They had not seen someone shield strangers before checking whether a camera angle favored him. They had not seen a smile that was not hungry. Luffy helped civilians out of the bus, laughed when one of them asked if he was with Vought, and then got distracted trying to figure out why everyone looked so terrified when the danger was over. Because the danger was never over here. Within minutes, the city's networks exploded with speculation. Unknown enhanced individual. Possible foreign weapon. Terror suspect. Failed lab asset. Vought analysts tore through security feeds looking for branding, origin signatures, genetic markers, anything that would allow them to classify the impossible young man in the straw hat. No records appeared. No compound V patterns matched. His body moved in ways the sensors could not explain. Frames distorted when he accelerated. Energy readings vanished around him as though the machines themselves could not decide what they were observing. And in the upper floors of Vought Tower, Homelander watched the clips in mounting irritation. At first he smiled. He always smiled when something new appeared, especially if it looked weak enough to crush publicly. But then the footage kept playing. It showed civilians cheering, not because they had been told to cheer, but because relief had burst out of them before they could stop it. It showed a child laughing when Luffy made a face after being handcuffed to a bent lamppost by 3 panicking officers. It showed strangers pulling out their phones with something dangerously close to wonder in their eyes. Not worship, not fear. Something softer, something freer. Homelander's smile slowly disappeared. Below, on the ruined street, Luffy had finally stopped moving long enough to look up at one of the giant digital billboards mounted between skyscrapers. A polished commercial flickered across it. The 7 descended through heavenly light while triumphant music swelled. Citizens looked on with grateful tears. Homelander landed at the center, chin raised, cape flowing, every inch of him designed to embody salvation. The others posed around him in perfect formation. They looked magnificent. Luffy watched the ad all the way to the end. The civilians around him waited to see whether he would react with fear now that he understood whose world he had fallen into. Instead, he tilted his head. His grin faded not into dread but into something quieter and more thoughtful. He looked from the billboard to the people in the street, to the shaking hands, the forced excitement, the hollow applause still echoing from the staged rescue. For the first time since arriving, he went still. Then, in a voice so simple it cut deeper than any accusation, he asked the nearest person, "Why do these heroes look so sad?" Morning in this world arrived through glass and static. News anchors smiled over casualty counts. Morning shows turned tragedy into sponsored segments. Coffee cups steamed beside screens replaying last night's footage of the unidentified stranger who had interrupted a Vought-managed incident and somehow made it look real. By dawn, the internet had given him a dozen names. The rubber terrorist, the laughing soup, the straw hat weapon. Conspiracy forums called him a failed prototype. Fan accounts clipped his rescue into inspirational edits set to orchestral music. Stock analysts discussed the public relations risk of an unaffiliated hero archetype emerging outside Vought's ecosystem. And in the middle of all that noise, the man himself sat on the edge of a rooftop sharing breakfast with 2 sanitation workers who had no idea how he had gotten there. Luffy did not care about celebrity. He did not understand market share. He had no instinctive reverence for uniforms, logos, or carefully managed symbols of authority. If someone was strong, he wanted to know what they protected. If someone smiled, he wanted to know whether they meant it. That was the measure. Nothing else. And because this world had built itself on the assumption that power alone justified obedience, his indifference to hierarchy felt more dangerous than violence. He wandered the city like a living contradiction. He ate street food without paying attention to luxury restaurants above him. He ignored giant screens praising the 7 and instead stopped to help a vendor fix a broken cart. He laughed at armed officers trying to establish a perimeter around him because their voices carried more panic than command. When a wealthy socialite approached with a camera crew and asked how it felt to go viral overnight, he blinked and said he was mostly hungry. The clip spread faster than any scandal. People expected arrogance from the powerful. They understood threats, sermons, and self-promotion. But sincerity unsettled them. It had become too rare to process. That same sincerity was what drew Billy Butcher. Butcher had spent too many years looking into the mouths of monsters to trust anyone with extraordinary strength. He watched Luffy's footage in a dim room with the boys gathered around him and saw problems layered inside problems. The body mechanics were impossible. The impact resistance made no sense. No known V enhancement explained the elasticity, the brute force, or the absurd physicality of the man's movement. But what bothered Butcher most was not the power. It was the expression. No performance, no narcotic thrill, no superiority. Just a maddeningly genuine joy that made Butcher want to assume it was the most convincing lie he had ever seen. So he tracked him down the old-fashioned way. He found Luffy at a corner market eating enough sandwiches to bankrupt the owner if the owner had not been too stunned to ask for payment. Huey stayed back nervous. Frenchie was fascinated. Mother's Milk looked like a man trying to calculate the blast radius of optimism. Kimiko simply watched. Butcher approached with all the warmth of a knife being drawn from a coat. Luffy looked up mid-bite and grinned. "You look angry," he said. It was the kind of line that should have earned him a broken jaw from anyone else. Instead, Butcher stared at him partly because he hated being read so quickly and partly because the stranger said it without mockery. Just observation, plain as weather. Their first conversation was not dramatic. There were no threats that landed the way Butcher intended. No polished declarations. But there was a slow and deeply uncomfortable revelation that this bizarre man with impossible powers was not pretending to be good. He simply had no interest in being anything else. Butcher tested him anyway. Asked what he wanted. Asked who sent him. Asked which lab made him. Luffy answered with the same blunt honesty each time. He wanted food. A way home eventually, maybe. Nobody sent him. Nobody made him. And when Butcher pressed harder, trying to find the rot hidden underneath, Luffy turned the question around and asked him why he hated people he had not met yet. That nearly ended the conversation. Butcher's hatred was not abstract. It was grief hardened into doctrine. Soup's lying. Soup's took. Soup's broke the world and called it stewardship. That belief had kept him moving when everything else in him had gone numb. Yet sitting across from Luffy felt like being forced to hold that belief under a bright light and notice the cracks. The stranger did not argue like an idealist. He did not preach. He simply said that if strength only made people cruel, then they were weak in the only way that mattered. The words followed Butcher long after he walked away. Meanwhile, Vought scientists were losing their minds. Laboratories designed to quantify the impossible now sat crowded with data that refused to behave. Thermal readings scattered. Tissue simulations failed. Viral models rejected every assumed origin point. They captured slow motion footage of Luffy's body stretching and recoiling with impossible force. But the mathematics broke down when they tried to explain how mass, momentum, and resistance interacted inside him. It was not just that he had powers beyond their database. It was that he violated the philosophy beneath their science. Compound V produced results by distortion. It forced the human body into violent exaggerations of itself. Luffy did not feel distorted. He felt complete, as though his strength had grown out of him naturally because it belonged there. That possibility terrified them. Across the city, civilians kept encountering him in moments that should have belonged to someone else. A woman trapped in a stalled subway tunnel emerged laughing because the strange pirate with sandals had stretched through a maintenance grate and pulled people to safety like he was playing a game. A group of children in a neglected apartment block met him after he tore open a jammed fire escape and then asked if they had any meat. An old man whose store had been shaken down by local enforcers found those same men hanging from a traffic light half an hour after Luffy passed through the neighborhood. He did not make speeches. That was part of the problem. Vought knew how to manage slogans. It knew how to counter ideology with branding. But Luffy's influence spread through smaller things, through relief, through instinct, through the unsettling way people stood a little straighter after meeting him, as if he had reminded them of a shape their souls used to know. And every time he encountered a soup, he treated them like people instead of icons. He did not bow. He did not hesitate. If they were kind, he smiled. If they were cruel, he called them stupid to their faces. One lower-tier celebrity hero tried to intimidate him in a restaurant and ended up humiliated when Luffy, stretched across 3 tables to steal food from the man's plate while asking why he needed fans to feel big. The video leaked before Vought could bury it. Millions watched a supposedly superior being reduced to sputtering outrage by someone who simply refused to acknowledge the script everyone else lived under. That refusal began to spread like a sickness through the system. By the time Vought organized a major public event to reassert control, tension had become almost visible. The rally was staged as a celebration of unity. Families were brought in, flags waved. The 7 appeared beneath showers of artificial light. Homelander smiled for the crowd with the unbearable brightness of a false sun. His voice carried over the plaza in perfectly measured tones as he spoke about safety, sacrifice, and the sacred responsibility of power. Every sentence had been tested in focus groups, every pause calibrated. Then Luffy wandered into the event because he smelled grilled food. Security scrambled, cameras pivoted. The crowd rippled with shocked excitement. Homelander's jaw tightened for only a fraction of a second, but that was enough. He descended from the stage with the confidence of a king stepping down to correct a peasant. He expected fear. Even opposition would have been acceptable. Anger he understood. Reverence was best of all. What he did not expect was Luffy glancing at him, chewing thoughtfully, and saying, "Oh, you are the sad guy from the sign." A laugh escaped the crowd before it could be suppressed. Homelander heard it. More importantly, he felt what came after it. Not terror. Not the usual desperate silence. Something loosening. Something dangerously human. So he did what he always did when control threatened to slip. He escalated. His hand shot forward faster than most people could track, a violent little gesture meant to remind everyone of the difference between symbol and flesh. Luffy caught the punch casually. No strain. No dramatic build. Just an open palm closing around Homelander's fist as if he had intercepted a child's tantrum. The impact thundered through the plaza, shattering stone beneath their feet. Gasps swept outward. Cameras shook. Homelander pushed harder, heat rising behind his eyes, but Luffy simply looked at him with mild surprise, then grinned in a way that made the moment far worse than any act of aggression could have, because he was not impressed. And for the first time in front of a live crowd that was no longer entirely afraid, Homelander realized he was touching someone he could not immediately make kneel. Humiliation had always been a private thing for Homelander. It happened in sealed rooms, in the brief dead space between public adoration and solitary reflection, in the small moments when a compliment rang hollow and he could hear the emptiness beneath it. He knew how to hide those fractures. He had built an entire identity around shining so brightly that nobody would dare stare long enough to notice the rot at the center. But what happened in the plaza was different. It was public, recorded, replayed from every angle. Frame by frame, the world watched the strongest man alive throw a warning strike and have it stopped by a smiling stranger who looked more curious than threatened. The clip spread too quickly to erase and too cleanly to distort. Vought tried. They called it edited. They called it provocation. They called it foreign interference. But none of those narratives explained the look on Homelander's face for the single second after contact. Not rage. Confusion. That confusion became obsession. He watched every new piece of footage involving Luffy. Not once. Hundreds of times. Luffy helping civilians climb from wreckage while joking about dinner. Luffy sharing food with workers after a chemical leak. Luffy carrying an injured child through smoke while grinning at the little boy and promising the fire was already getting bored. Again and again, Homelander searched those clips for a tell, some glimmer of manipulation. A predatory hunger hidden under the warmth. A strategy. A calculation. But the more he watched, the worse it became, because Luffy was not performing goodness. He was simply living as though kindness required no audience. People reacted to that in ways Vought had not prepared for. The internet became a battlefield not of facts but of feeling. Threads appeared from eyewitnesses who described encountering Luffy in the aftermath of disasters before official responders arrived. Some were probably exaggerated. Some were certainly fabricated. That almost did not matter. The emotional pattern was real. People said they felt safer around him. They said he listened before acting. They said he laughed like nothing in the world could corrupt joy itself. In a culture built on worshiping superiority, he moved through the cracks as a reminder that power could be intimate instead of theatrical. Every shared clip weakened the idea that fear and protection had to travel together. Homelander hated the word happier most of all. Not stronger. Not inspired. It appeared again and again in comment sections, articles, whispered interviews, and unsecured internal Vought reports. The public mood in districts where Luffy had been seen was measurably different. Anxiety indicators dipped. Civilian cooperation during crises improved. Even media focus groups reported that audiences described him as weirdly comforting. That was the true horror. Fear created obedience. Awe created dependency. But happiness created choice, and choice made control uncertain. So Homelander sought him out directly. Their first private meeting happened above the city at dusk, where the last light bled orange across the windows of skyscrapers and helicopters stayed far enough away to avoid becoming collateral. Luffy sat cross-legged on the edge of a tower, eating noodles from a takeout carton as though none of this was unusual. Homelander landed behind him with the soft, deliberate restraint of a man holding an earthquake inside his skin. There were threats in his posture, in the angle of his shoulders, and the way the air itself seemed to tighten around him. Luffy looked back, squinted, and held out the carton. Want some? No one had ever disarmed Homelander so effortlessly. He refused, of course. The refusal came sharp and wounded, like an insult thrown at a person who had not realized a fight had begun. He asked what Luffy wanted. He asked why he was interfering. He asked who he thought he was to step into this world and make people question their heroes. Luffy listened, finished chewing, and answered with that same maddening honesty. "I do not like the way you look at people," he said. "Like they are toys that forgot who owns them." Something in Homelander's expression flickered. Luffy saw it instantly. That was what made him so unbearable. He did not analyze Homelander psychologically in the language of therapists or strategists. He simply felt the shape of him. He sensed the ache hiding beneath the violence, the loneliness buried under the performance. The way every word Homelander spoke was secretly begging to be believed, not because it was true, but because without belief he would collapse into whatever had been left unfinished in him long ago. Luffy did not fear him. Worse, he pitied him. For Homelander, pity was unbearable. Meanwhile, the truth of this world kept finding Luffy piece by piece. The boys had not intended to trust him, but circumstances forced proximity. Vought escalations created common enemies. Butcher, against every instinct he possessed, found himself explaining things no outsider should have needed explained. Compound versus child experimentation. Manufactured legends. The pipeline that turned trauma into product and product into obedience. At first, Luffy struggled to understand why anyone would create strong people only to use them as cages for everyone else. Then he stopped struggling and simply got angry. It was a quiet anger at first. He saw the archived footage of children in hospital gowns being dosed without consent. He saw internal files where tragedies were categorized by reputational risk. He walked through neighborhoods deliberately kept unsafe so the right heroes could later arrive on schedule. He spoke to parents whose sons and daughters had been promised salvation and delivered to laboratories. With each revelation, his smile remained, but something changed inside it. Not its warmth, its purpose. Before he had laughed because life itself delighted him. Now he laughed in defiance too, as if refusing to let this world teach him its hopelessness. That made him more dangerous than ever. Vought responded with harsher measures. Media campaigns painted him as an unstable anomaly. Paid pundits questioned whether his cheerful behavior masked psychosis. Tactical teams were dispatched with experimental weaponry tuned to disrupt unknown biosignatures. None of it worked. Luffy slipped through traps with absurd creativity, using the city itself as a playground, turning assaults into humiliations. He ricocheted between buildings, tangled armored convoys in their own restraints, and disarmed elite operatives with the casual irreverence of a man refusing to grant seriousness to people who had mistaken cruelty for authority. Each failure fed public myth. He was becoming more than a rogue soup in the cultural imagination. He was becoming a symbol, though he would have laughed at the word. To some, he was a joke that got out of hand. To others, he was an omen. To children, he was the smiling guy who showed up before the branded heroes and never asked for applause. To the desperate, he became a whispered possibility. Maybe strength did not always corrupt. Maybe the strongest person in the room did not have to make everyone else feel small. Maybe fear was not the natural order of things. Homelander felt those maybes like knives. Their next confrontation took place after a tower fire caused by Vought cost-cutting. Measures swept through a housing block they had ignored in all safety assessments. Official responders delayed while legal departments argued exposure. Civilians were still trapped when Luffy arrived. He tore open floors, carried families down through smoke, and kept smiling the whole time so the children would not cry. When Homelander finally appeared for the cameras, he found Luffy covered in ash, handing out bottled water and grilled meat from a looted supermarket truck with the solemn satisfaction of a man who had finished a necessary job. The cameras loved the contrast, so did the public. Homelander descended with his practiced expression of righteous command, but the crowd was not looking at him the way it should have. Their attention kept drifting back to Luffy. Gratitude had already chosen its direction before the official hero landed. That fracture, tiny and invisible to most, felt apocalyptic to Homelander. He demanded that Luffy step aside. Luffy refused. He said people were still hurt. He said there was no time for posing. That last word struck like a slap. The confrontation that followed did not become an all-out battle, only because Luffy refused to give Homelander the war he wanted in front of civilians. But the emotional damage was worse than physical violence. Homelander raged. Luffy stayed calm. Homelander threatened. Luffy shrugged. Homelander shouted about respect, order, superiority, and the burden of being above everyone else. Luffy looked at him and asked a question so simple it cut deeper than any punch. If you are really above everyone, why do you sound so lonely? The crowd heard it. More dangerously, Homelander heard himself having no answer. From that moment on, destruction accelerated. Social media became impossible to contain. Workers leaked Vought documents. Reporters who had buried their consciences for years started pushing harder, emboldened by the fact that someone out there could challenge the invincible face of the system and laugh while doing it. Lower-tier heroes began hesitating during operations, unsure whether the public might compare them unfavorably to the pirate who acted without waiting for permission. Even Butcher, who hated Hope on principle, found himself unable to dismiss the effect Luffy was having. It was too real, too contagious, too human. Then the city paid for Vought's greed in blood. A containment failure in one of the corporation's hidden facilities spilled experimental compounds into a populated district. Sirens blared too late. Emergency services were blocked from entering until executives could coordinate liability. Families died waiting for protocols to clear. Luffy arrived in time to save many, but not enough. When the smoke settled and the bodies lay under silver blankets on a street lit by corporate billboards, he stood in the middle of the ruin and did not move. The reporters noticed first. The children noticed next. Monkey D. Luffy, who had met every absurdity of this world with laughter, looked down at the dead and stopped smiling. Silence changed him more than rage ever could. Those who saw Luffy standing among the dead expected an explosion. They expected the wild force they had begun to fear and admire to answer grief with violence. Instead, they witnessed something quieter, and because it was quieter, it felt far more serious. He knelt beside a covered body, rested a hand on the pavement, and listened to the city as though it had spoken to him through the smoke. When he finally lifted his head, the light in his eyes had not dimmed. It had sharpened. His smile returned, but it came back transformed. No longer just the grin of a reckless adventurer. Now it carried judgment. From that day forward, he stopped wandering and started choosing targets. Not governments in the abstract, not laws, not symbols, chains. Wherever he found them, he broke them. Vought laboratories hidden beneath charitable foundations. Detention centers that processed enhanced children-like inventory. Black sites where failed experiments were buried alive under euphemisms and security clearances. He tore through them all with the brutal simplicity of a man who saw no difference between a prison wall and a lie backed by force. Every strike was chaotic. None followed a conventional pattern. Analysts tried to map his behavior and failed because his logic was moral rather than tactical. He went where suffering was loudest and acted faster than any predictive model could keep up. The world began changing around that rhythm. Protests ignited first in neighborhoods Vought had long considered manageable. People came into the streets with homemade signs, shaky voices, and a dangerous new habit of asking questions on camera. Why were disasters monetized? Why were soups above the law? Why did heroism always arrive hand in hand with sponsorship deals and body counts? At first, the demonstrations were easy to mock. Then they spread. Families joined. Workers joined. Survivors joined. The old fear was still there, but it no longer stood alone. Something else had entered the room. Possibility. Vought understood the danger immediately. The company could survive scandals. It could survive leaked documents, isolated lawsuits, even the occasional catastrophic incident if the story was managed quickly enough. What it could not easily survive was a shift in emotional gravity. Once people started imagining life outside the structure of worship and fear, every pillar of the system grew unstable at once. Investors wavered. Internal factions hardened. Political allies privately demanded reassurances that sounded suspiciously like panic. And at the center of every new problem was the same impossible image. A grinning pirate in a straw hat destroying armored compounds with his bare hands and leaving survivors behind him who looked less traumatized than awakened. For Billy Butcher, this was the part that became hardest to bear. Hatred had always given him shape. Without it, he risked becoming a ruin with no architecture left inside. Watching Luffy tear into Vought should have been satisfying. In some crude sense it was. Facilities burned. Programs collapsed. Monsters died screaming. Yet none of it carried the flavor Butcher expected. Luffy did not destroy because he enjoyed revenge. He destroyed because chains offended him on a spiritual level. He hit like a storm, but he never lingered over cruelty. He never savored fear. He tore systems apart and then turned around to feed survivors, comfort children, or laugh with workers clearing debris. Butcher had no framework for that. It was too powerful to dismiss and too pure to trust. Their arguments deepened. "You cannot fix this world by punching everything," Butcher said one night in the gutted remains of a Vought archive room. Luffy sat atop a crushed server bank, chewing thoughtfully. "Maybe not everything," he answered. "Just the things hurting people." That answer infuriated Butcher because of how childish it sounded and how impossible it was to refute. The world was complicated, layered with institutions, incentives, and compromised human beings. Butcher believed complexity justified cynicism. Luffy treated complexity as camouflage. If a machine existed to make suffering profitable, then from his perspective it deserved to be smashed no matter how elegant its excuses were. While the resistance below struggled to define what was happening, Homelander was disintegrating above them. He could still fill a stadium with applause. He could still make governments flinch. He could still kill almost anyone alive. But the emotional monopoly he had depended on was fracturing, and each fracture made him more erratic. He appeared on live television with increasing frequency, delivering speeches about unity that sounded like threats dressed in patriotic clothing. He visited disaster zones before they were secure and stared too long at the cameras, as if daring the audience to betray him. In private, his anger had curdled into paranoia. Every hesitation from an ally looked like treason. Every leaked memo felt personal. Every smile directed at Luffy from a civilian became an act of theft, because that was how Homelander understood love, as possession. Vought's answer was escalation through science. If conventional soups could not stop Luffy, then new weapons would be built specifically for him. Enhanced Compound V variants were rushed through illegal trials. Failed prototypes piled up in refrigerated vaults and unmarked graves. Engineers crafted countermeasures intended to harden impact resistance, weaponize kinetic absorption, and flood battlefields with adaptive chemical suppressants. Executives called them strategic assets. Researchers in their honest moments called them prayers made in laboratories. They were trying to engineer an answer to someone whose greatest advantage was not merely power but imagination. Luffy did not fight according to optimized instincts. He fought like freedom itself had a sense of humor. The first deployment ended in catastrophe. A heavily modified strike unit intercepted him outside a hidden transport corridor where traffic test subjects were being moved off-site. The enhanced soups hit hard, faster, and heavier than anything he had yet faced in this world. Their bones had been reinforced, their responses algorithmically trained, their pain dampened. Under normal conditions, they might have overwhelmed entire military divisions. Luffy looked at them for 1 second, realized they smelled like suffering, and got angry in a way the city had not yet seen. He turned the corridor into a thunderstorm of broken steel and ricocheting bodies. He bounced attacks back at impossible angles, wrapped one opponent around a support beam, drove another through 3 armored carriers, and used the collapsing roadway itself as a slingshot to launch the last unit into the Hudson like discarded scrap. The rescued prisoners watched him as if he had stepped out of myth. News of the battle spread faster than Vought could censor it. The company denied everything. Independent footage surfaced anyway. Public trust began to collapse in earnest. Underground resistance groups that had once operated in isolated cells started coordinating. Journalists who would never have dared publish certain evidence now did so because the atmosphere had changed just enough to make silence feel more dangerous than speech. Even within the hero community, fractures widened. Some lower-profile soups quietly vanished from public life rather than stand on the wrong side of the next inevitable confrontation. And through all of it, Luffy remained strangely unchanged. He still laughed, still got lost, still cared more about food than prestige. That contrast only intensified his influence. In another story, a revolutionary figure might have become solemn, consumed by burden, sculpted into leadership. Luffy refused that shape. He was not trying to rule the world, reform its institutions, or replace one hierarchy with another. He wanted people free. That simplicity made him impossible for the system to absorb because systems survive by converting rebellion into structure. There was nothing to convert. He was a pirate at the center of a spiritual uprising. Eventually, Homelander chose the most obvious weapon left to him. The worldwide broadcast was announced as an emergency address on the future of national security. Networks stopped regular programming. Airports and offices paused. Screens in bars, train stations, schools, and apartment towers all switched to the same image. Homelander stood alone against a backdrop of flags and blazing light, every line of the stage crafted to frame him as civilization's last uncompromised guardian. His voice emerged calm, but only if one did not listen closely enough to hear the cracks beneath it. He spoke of infiltration, of instability, of outside threats masquerading as hope. He said the mysterious individual known as Straw Hat had orchestrated terror events, manipulated public emotion, and attacked lawful institutions created to keep humanity safe. He warned that smiling faces could hide monstrous intent. He said disorder was seductive. He said freedom without control was just another word for chaos. Then he gave the world its final choice. In a tone meant to sound resolute but poisoned by desperation, Homelander declared Monkey D. Luffy an enemy of humanity. Once that line had been spoken publicly, something ancient and irrational awakened in the world's imagination. An enemy of humanity should have inspired panic. In earlier days it would have. Yet by the time Homelander made his declaration, too many people had already seen the difference with their own eyes. They had watched false heroes save only what was profitable. They had watched the pirate appear where cameras were absent. They had seen the contrast so often that the official language no longer landed with its old force. The broadcast did not erase Luffy's image. It elevated it. If the most feared man on Earth was terrified of a laughing stranger who kept pulling civilians out of burning buildings, then what exactly had the world been bowing to all this time? Stories multiplied faster than facts. A nurse in Chicago claimed patients recovered more calmly after a live stream of Luffy's latest rescue played in the ward. A dock worker in Baltimore swore an entire line of armed enforcers hesitated when children began chanting for the Straw Hat Pirate to come. In Sao Paulo, protesters painted a grinning sun on riot shields and said it made them feel less afraid. Most of these things could not be measured. That was the problem. They belonged to the realm Vought had always tried to dominate indirectly but never truly understood. Shared emotion. Luffy, without intending to, had entered that realm completely. The name began as a joke among online communities. Sun God. It started because of the way he appeared after disasters, all warmth and impossible energy, crashing into scenes of despair like sunrise arriving too early. Then the name kept sticking. It crossed languages. It appeared in chants, graffiti, leaked internal memos, and frightened corporate briefings. Some used it playfully. Others used it with half-serious reverence. Vought tried to scrub it from platforms, but suppression only made it spread. Human beings are strange. Tell them not to imagine a miracle, and many will immediately begin building one from scraps. Luffy himself barely noticed. He was too busy fighting monsters built specifically to kill him. Vought's newest superweapons were no longer designed for public optics. These things were war assets born in hidden chambers and fed on tactical doctrine stripped of all morality. Some resembled heroes only in the most technical sense. Their humanity had been cut down to the minimum required for command recognition. They came equipped with adaptive compounds, pain nullification, integrated targeting support, and mission parameters that treated civilian casualties as acceptable drift. Against anyone else, they would have represented the future of coercive power. Against Luffy, they became grim lessons in the limits of engineering. Each battle pushed him harder than the last. There were moments now when the air around him seemed to answer his will before his body moved. Moments when laughter in the middle of combat sounded less like amusement and more like a force changing the shape of the battlefield. He became spring-like, then storm-like, then something even stranger. The world around him bent toward absurdity in brief flashes that defied reason. Concrete warped. Impacts echoed with impossible elasticity. Enemies found themselves hesitating at crucial instants, not because they had calculated danger, but because some deeper instinct recoiled from the vitality pouring off him. Hope, once a private sensation, had begun radiating from him like heat. Butcher saw it happening and hated how much it moved him. He had spent years telling himself power always corrupted because the alternative was too painful. If there existed even one truly mighty being who could remain human, then his cynicism was not wisdom. It was surrender. Watching Luffy hold collapsing bridges together with one hand while laughing at terrified civilians until they found the courage to run, Butcher felt the old structure inside him groan. The pirate was not naive. That had become clear. He had seen the laboratories, the child graves, the markets built on suffering. He understood evil better now than most saints ever would. And still he chose not to become it. That choice terrified Butcher more than any monster. Because it meant Butcher had choices too. Their conversations grew stranger and more honest. One night, after a raid on a Vought black site beneath an abandoned cathedral, they sat in the broken nave while rain tapped through holes in the roof. Butcher asked him why he kept smiling when everything around them was rotten. Luffy answered without dramatic flourish. Because if bad people can laugh while hurting everyone, then good people should laugh louder when they are protecting them. The words were simple enough to sound foolish, but in the echoing ruin they landed like doctrine from a gentler god. Meanwhile, Homelander was coming apart. He could no longer understand the emotional math of the world. He had been raised on a principle so deep it felt like gravity. People love strength because they fear it. Fear becomes reverence. Reverence becomes dependence. That was order. That was truth. Yet Luffy violated the equation simply by existing. People followed him willingly. They cheered not because they were cornered into gratitude, but because their hearts moved toward him on their own. Homelander could not endure that. It struck deeper than rivalry. It rewrote the foundation of his identity. He tried violence first, then intimidation, then mass retaliation through systems loyal to him. None of it restored what had been lost. Each overreaction made him look smaller. Each public threat highlighted Luffy's ease by comparison. There is nothing more damaging to manufactured divinity than the presence of someone who never wanted to be worshipped, and yet inspires devotion anyway. The city sensed the coming climax before it arrived. New York had lived too long under the pressure of false gods not to recognize when one was being challenged. Tension gathered above the skyline like weather. Resistance networks moved civilians underground. Vought fortified key towers and relocated executives to secure compounds. News channels filled with speculative dread. International governments quietly prepared contingency plans for urban annihilation. Across rooftops and alley walls, the image of the Straw Hat Sun continued spreading, bright and absurd and almost childlike against the steel severity of the city. Then the battle began in full view of heaven. It started at dusk when a Vought aerial dread platform descended over Midtown, broadcasting a demand for Luffy's surrender while weapon arrays opened like metal flowers across its hull. Homelander hovered above it, cape thrashing in the wind, eyes burning red enough to stain the clouds. Luffy arrived not with military formation or heroic fanfare, but by launching himself from 3 blocks away in a blur of speed and laughter, landing atop the platform hard enough to buckle its armored spine. What followed no camera could fully contain. Homelander came at him with all the fury of a man who had finally decided to make the world choose. Laser vision carved through the storming sky in crimson torrents. Luffy twisted through them with impossible elasticity, his body moving like instinct had become art. Shockwaves shattered windows across entire avenues. Metal screamed. The dread platforms split open beneath them. Vought weapons fired, missed, and tore their own infrastructure apart. Civilians watching from shelters saw a red storm clashing against something brighter and stranger, as if dawn itself had taken human shape and refused to kneel. And still Luffy smiled. Not because the fight was easy. It was not. Homelander had crossed beyond arrogance into true desperation, and desperate power is among the ugliest things in existence. He struck to dominate, to erase, to punish reality for not loving him correctly. Yet every blow he landed seemed only to sharpen the contrast. Luffy fought with joy even when injured. He fought as if freedom itself were worth celebrating in the middle of ruin. The more Homelander raged, the more inhuman he looked. The more Luffy laughed, the more human he seemed despite the impossible force pouring from him. Crowds below began chanting without coordination. Not slogans, not political demands, just his name. Then the other name, Sun God. It rolled through streets and shelters and digital streams with the terrifying intimacy of collective belief. Even enemies hesitated. There are moments in history when a symbol stops being metaphor and becomes event. This was one of them. High above the burning avenues, Homelander heard the chant and finally broke. He slammed Luffy through the side of a tower, followed him into the debris cloud, seized him by the shoulders, and screamed with a voice torn raw by every wound inside him. It was not a command, not really. It was the shriek of a child abandoned inside a god's body, the cry of someone watching the only thing he had ever mistaken for love drift beyond his grasp. Why do they love you? The city heard him. And in the stunned silence that followed even before the final war truly began, the answer was already visible in everything Luffy had become. Once Homelander asked that question aloud, the world crossed a threshold it could never walk back. No corporation could package that scream. No media strategist could fold it neatly into a narrative of controlled strength. It traveled through every platform and every frightened household with the force of revelation. People had always known, somewhere beneath the conditioning, that their guardian was unstable. They had sensed the hunger in him, the endless need beneath the flag wrapped around his shoulders. But to hear that need laid bare above a burning skyline changed the nature of the conflict. This was no longer a contest over public trust. It was naked theology collapsing under its own emptiness. Vought answered the way dying empires always do, with total escalation. Emergency powers were invoked through private influence. Enhanced soup regiments were released from classified reserves. Financial districts locked down. Transportation arteries were seized. Government spokespeople used words like extraordinary measures and temporary stabilization while cities prepared for war in everything but name. Beneath New York, the final Compound V production systems roared to life at unsustainable output, pumping accelerated formulations toward field assets who would not survive the month, even if they won the week. Vought was no longer protecting its market position. It was defending the right of fear to define reality. The city descended with it. Towers burned from precision strikes gone wrong. Airspace fractured beneath supersonic collisions. Enhanced subjects, half-controlled and half-feral, rampaged through business corridors and luxury districts alike. Streets packed with fleeing civilians became rivers of red brake lights and broken glass. Sirens were swallowed by deeper sounds. Concrete folding, aircraft screaming, laser bursts cracking open facades that had once reflected the illusion of order. Yet amid the panic, something remarkable kept happening. Ordinary people helped each other first. They formed chains across rubble. They pulled strangers through subway tunnels. They chose solidarity with an urgency this world had almost forgotten it possessed. Luffy moved through that chaos like a promise refusing to die. He fought everywhere at once, or so it seemed to those on the ground. One moment he was hurling an armored superweapon through the crown of a Vought monument. The next he was carrying trapped office workers down 40 flights of a collapsing stairwell. He tore apart assault convoys, redirected falling debris, and laughed in the face of enemies who had built their entire identity around making others tremble. Even wounded, he radiated a warmth that made courage feel contagious. It was not invincibility people responded to. It was spirit. The unbroken certainty that no throne built on fear deserved to stand another day. That certainty spread into the heart of the resistance. Butcher, Mother's Milk, Frenchie, Kimiko, and Huey used the war above as cover to go after the real spine of the system below. Guided by stolen schematics and the fragments of conscience leaking from terrified insiders, they descended into the Undercity beneath Vought Tower where the final production nexus of Compound V was hidden. It was less a laboratory than a cathedral to corruption. Endless pipes carried glowing chemical light through chambers lined with observation glass. Incubation vaults pulsed like mechanical wombs. Security systems treated human life as a statistic to be optimized. Here, beneath the rhetoric of heroism, was the truth of the age. Manufactured gods, assembly line miracles, cruelty made scalable. Butcher stood before it all and felt something colder than hatred. He felt clarity. For years he had lived as if vengeance alone were enough. Now, with the city above him splitting apart and Luffy giving people a reason to imagine more than revenge, Butcher saw the system for what it was. Not just a nest of monsters to slaughter, but a machine that taught everyone to become smaller versions of the same sickness. Domination. The worship of force divorced from humanity. If this place survived, the cycle survived. If it burned, something else might finally have room to grow. So they set the charges. Above them, Homelander stopped pretending he wanted victory with minimal damage. His battle with Luffy became something mythic and hideous, too large for hero language. Crimson beams ripped through rain clouds and sent molten glass spilling from towers. Luffy answered with force that looked increasingly impossible to classify. His body moved like freedom, unbound from common sense, springing, swelling, rebounding, turning the logic of combat itself into a mockery of rigid power. He stretched around attacks that should have ended him, grinned through blood, and met Homelander's rage with an almost joyful defiance that felt unbearable to witness. One fought to rule the world by making it kneel. The other fought so nobody would have to kneel again. That contrast broke people open. There were civilians watching from shattered apartments who began crying without knowing why. There were soldiers ordered to maintain perimeters who lowered their weapons when they heard children chanting for the man in the straw hat. There were lower-tier soups who simply walked off the field because they could no longer endure the lie that strength existed only to dominate. History does not always turn on policy. Sometimes it turns because a hidden emotional truth becomes impossible to unsee. Homelander sensed it and became more savage. He drove Luffy through office blocks, hurled him across avenues, and cut burning scars through the skyline with heat vision so intense that clouds glowed red from beneath. Yet every escalation cost him something. His control, his image, his mask. The more violently he tried to prove that fear was the only language power respected, the more clearly the world saw what Luffy had seen from the beginning. Not a god, not a protector, just a lonely tyrant inside a perfect costume, terrified that love given freely would never choose him. Luffy understood that too, but he could not indulge it anymore. There are enemies you laugh with, enemies you outgrow, enemies you pity. And then there are enemies who keep hurting people while begging the world to soothe the wound inside them. Those enemies must be stopped. Luffy's smile never vanished, but it shifted again as the battle reached its peak. It became fierce. The kind of smile that belongs not to innocence but to conviction. He had seen enough of this world now to know what was at stake. Not conquest, not reputation. The right of ordinary people to breathe without worshiping their own oppressors. Beneath the city, the boys reached the core. Alarms howled. Security teams closed in. Frenchie bled from a shoulder wound while rerouting the coolant grid. Kimiko tore through enhanced guards with a ferocity born of every violation Vought had ever buried. Huey, trembling and resolute, carried detonators deeper into the chamber than anyone thought he could. Mother's Milk coordinated evacuation routes for imprisoned test subjects while Butcher made the final walk toward the central reactor that fed the entire Compound V network. Glass tanks towered above him like a forest of unborn horrors. He placed the last explosive by hand. When he stepped back, he did not deliver a speech. He did not need one. Above him, the city was already choosing its future. At the same moment, high over the burning skyline, Luffy finally crossed into the full truth of the power sleeping within him. It was not merely strength. It was liberation made flesh. His presence brightened until even the smoke seemed to recoil. His hair and form took on a radiant, impossible quality, white and gleaming against the storm, while his laughter rolled across the city like dawn breaking through prison bars. The image struck every witness differently. To some it looked divine, to others absurd. To children it looked wonderful. To Homelander it looked like the death of everything fear had built. The explosion below erupted first. Vought's undercity convulsed as the production systems detonated in sequence, tearing through vaults, pipelines, and research cathedrals with catastrophic force. Chemical fires bloomed underground. Towers above shuddered. Data centers went dark. Supply networks flatlined. The machine that had manufactured false saviors for generations began collapsing into its own grave. Then Luffy rose above the ruined skyline in his full sun god form, smiling down upon a world on the edge of rebirth, while Homelander stared up at him and understood that false heroes were finally falling. In the end, the world did not become quiet all at once. Cities never do after they have been taught to scream for so long. New York smoldered beneath a bruised dawn, its skyline broken, its avenues flooded with ash, emergency lights, and the stunned movements of survivors who could not yet tell whether history had ended or begun. Vought Tower was a ruin of glass and twisted steel. The underground systems that had fed its empire were burning out in sealed darkness below. The Seven were shattered as an idea even before the last remnants of their power structure were dragged into public view. Governments issued statements. Markets convulsed. News networks switched tones every hour, unsure whether to mourn, condemn, or pretend they had seen this coming. None of it changed the deeper truth moving through the survivors like sunrise through a frozen field. Fear had lost its crown. Homelander's fall was not clean or triumphant in the simplistic way stories often prefer. Too much had burned for that. Too many people had died. But what mattered was final all the same. The strongest symbol of domination in that world had been broken, not by a stronger tyrant demanding replacement worship, but by someone who never wanted to rule at all. That difference settled into human hearts with strange, destabilizing force. Children who had grown up beneath giant corporate faces now looked at those screens with suspicion instead of awe. Adults who had spent years swallowing obedience as survival found themselves asking dangerous questions in ordinary voices. The old world had not vanished overnight. It had simply stopped feeling inevitable. Rescue efforts spread across the city, and in the strange tenderness that follows catastrophe, people began behaving like a population waking from hypnosis. Strangers fed each other from improvised kitchens. Medics worked beside former Vought employees who had finally chosen conscience over salary. Communities built shelters without waiting for branded saviors. Every act was small compared to the scale of the ruin, and yet together they formed the first architecture of a new age. Not a perfect one, not a peaceful one, but one no longer organized entirely around worshiping fear. Luffy moved through that aftermath with the same easy warmth that had changed everything in the first place. He helped lift debris, shared food, laughed with children who asked whether he was really a pirate or some kind of sun spirit. He answered both questions with the same delighted shrug. The impossible radiance of his awakened form had faded back into the familiar shape of the young man in the straw hat, which somehow made his presence even more moving. After all the mythological terror of the final battle, he was once again just Luffy, grinning, entirely uninterested in acting like a savior. He had done what needed doing. Now he wanted to make sure people were okay. That simple instinct left marks deeper than monuments. Butcher found him at the edge of the harbor 2 days after the war, sitting on a broken section of seawall and staring out at the morning water as if listening for something far away. The sky above the Atlantic shimmered faintly, where the dimensional rupture had begun to reopen, a wound in reality healing just enough to remember its shape. Time was running short. Whatever had brought Luffy into this universe was beginning to pull him onward again. For a while, Butcher said nothing. He was not a man built for gratitude. He had too much wreckage inside him for easy grace. Yet standing there, with the city behind them learning how to breathe without its boot on its own throat, he understood that silence would be cowardice. So he spoke the closest thing he had to an apology. "I spent years thinking anyone with that kind of power would turn into a monster," he said. Luffy looked at him, then out at the water again. "Maybe a lot of them do," he answered. "But that does not mean they have to." That was the unbearable part. Not the wisdom of it, but the ease. Luffy spoke as if goodness were difficult yet natural, a path anyone might walk if they stopped inventing reasons not to. Butcher hated how much he needed to hear that. Hated, too, that he believed it. Their final conversation was quiet, stripped of the arguments that had once defined them. Butcher asked whether Luffy would stay if he could. Luffy said there were too many seas and too many worlds to stop moving for long. But he also said this world did not need him the same way it had when he first arrived. That, more than anything, was the proof that he had succeeded. A real liberator leaves people less dependent, not more. As the light above the water deepened, survivors began gathering along the shoreline and nearby rooftops. The news had spread quickly. Nobody wanted to miss his departure, though few fully understood what they were witnessing. Some came out of gratitude, some out of grief, some because myth, once it walks the streets with you, is hard to let vanish without a goodbye. There were workers in soot-stained clothes, children with makeshift straw hat drawings, medics, protesters, former skeptics, and people who had once cheered Homelander because they had never imagined another option. Now they stood together in the salt wind and watched the sky open like a distant memory. Luffy turned toward them with that same smile, not triumphant, not solemn, just bright. He looked across the crowd, at faces still bruised by exhaustion and hope, and said the one thing this world needed to hear from him before he left. Nobody should be scared to smile. Many of them cried then, though the tears were lighter than grief. There are moments when a sentence becomes a key, not because it is elaborate, but because it unlocks something people had buried for too long. The crowd did not cheer immediately. They simply stood there taking in the possibility that life might actually be lived by that rule. Then Luffy laughed. It was a full, joyous sound, the kind that had once seemed absurd against the machinery of this world and now felt like its truest surviving music. He stepped back, touched the brim of his straw hat, and launched himself toward the opening sky. For an instant his silhouette crossed the glowing rupture with the same reckless freedom that had brought him crashing into this universe in the first place. Then the light folded around him, and he was gone. The silence he left behind was different from the one that had changed him. This silence was not despair. It was reflection. The crowd kept staring upward long after the sky sealed itself, as if expecting laughter to echo back one more time. In a way it did. Not from above, but from among them. A child laughed first, then another, softly, uncertainly, as if practicing a language nearly lost. Months passed. Vought collapsed under the weight of exposure, financial ruin, and the irreversible destruction of its production systems. Trials began. Archives opened. Hidden crimes surfaced faster than institutions could bury them. The Seven ceased to exist, first as a functioning unit and then as a cultural spell. Humanity did not become innocent. Rebuilding was slow, ugly, and full of compromise. But the emotional center of the world had shifted. Citizens questioned authority with less fear. Children stopped talking about power as if it automatically deserved obedience. Resistance networks transformed into community structures. In murals across recovering cities, a straw hat and a radiant sun appeared again and again, sometimes playful, sometimes sacred, always smiling. And somewhere far beyond that repaired horizon, beyond dimensions and ruptures and worlds poisoned by false gods, a ship sailed beneath endless stars. Moonlight rested on worn wood. The sea breathed quietly against the hull. At the bow, a familiar straw hat sat still in the silver glow while distant laughter drifted over the water like a promise that adventure, freedom, and joy would always find each other again. And for the first time in a world ruled by fear, humanity remembered how to laugh.